Hello and welcome to ChatDPS. This is the 52nd episode, so quite clearly we're here for a good time and a long time. So that's really good. Joined by Adam and Robert as usual, and it's great to see you guys. Thanks very much for joining. This week we're going to put into effect. We're going to have a conversation around a recent report put out by DLA Piper around GDPR. And this report is kind of important, I guess, because Robert will probably tell you that what happens in Europe generally sort of gets reflected here at some point in the future. We seem to be a little bit behind them, but there's some really critical and key things that are coming out at this moment in time. The first point is really around security of processing personal data. The second point is around supply chain. And the third point, which was something that Adam brought up only last week or the week before, was around personal liability, obviously directors' liabilities, those kind of things. So, Robert, this is an interesting report. It's quite a long report. It goes into some detail. What were the highlights for you in terms of where this was going and what it was doing?
Yeah, so I think it's a report that comes out every year from this law firm focused on GDPR, and I know within Australia we've talked about it quite a bit. The upcoming changes to the Privacy Act. We're waiting for tranche 2. We don't have a timeline on that, so the government's gone pretty slow on introducing the next series of reforms. We were expecting from the Attorney General's original report for the Privacy Act to get much closer to GDPR. So I guess the expectation is we'll get there one day. Not sure what that day will be or what year that'll be, but let's say something in the next couple of years might come through. So yeah, like you say, it's always good to look to Europe. They are seen as the benchmark when it comes to privacy and AI and a whole bunch of other sort of technical regulations. And so I sort of went through the report. I picked a few things out just in terms of trends and, again, things to look out for, I guess, in 2026 and maybe beyond. And like you say, we do tend to lag Europe a fair bit, and particularly on GDPR. But yeah, like you say, and there's a few things there of note. So the first one, just having a look. So the review's gone back to 2025, and the first case that was highlighted in the report was that in the UK, the Information Commissioner imposed a fine of 16 million euros, which is roughly $28 million Australian, there or thereabouts, on an organisation called Capita. Capita does business process outsourcing in the UK. So a lot of that kind of grunt work that both public and private sector organizations don't want to do, they take that on. They're big. They're on the FTSE 100. I think they turn over something like 2+ billion a year pounds. So they're fairly substantial. They had a data breach, and that involved hackers stealing millions of people's information. And so the Information Commissioner found against them. They enforced a penalty, and they talked about how Capita had failed to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to safeguard the data they held. In particular, they'd failed to prevent privilege escalation and unauthorized lateral movement, respond appropriately to security alerts, or implement adequate penetration testing and risk assessments. So it's a little bit like Australian clinical labs that we talked about, and that was a landmark decision within Australia to have the first penalty under the Privacy Act. They also found that there was fault with their cybersecurity posture, the resilience, when they'd taken on a new organisation. So again, it's all sorts of things that these regulators are looking at. So they're listing off sort of guidance in terms of the things you should be looking at, the basics you should be getting right when it comes to data breach and incident response. There's parallels with ACL, and I think, again, it comes back to, are you getting the basics right when it comes to your business from a cybersecurity point of view? And it might point to, okay, so ACL gives certain guidance, but you need to be thinking more broadly about what the basics are. You can look at Essential A, but you can also look at other decisions, and you can look not just in terms of decisions in Australia, but I think something like this also offers helpful guidance about the things you should be doing to protect your organization here.
So Adam, from a CISO perspective, are these things easily missed, or are they? Is it just complex? Is it just the fact of, look, we're busy people, or what do you think that the sort of like the technical side of this is looking at?
It is easily missed. So the concern or the issue that you have is a lot of the time as a CISO, you end up getting pulled into operational land an awful lot. You most likely have a SOC under you. You've got a number of these technical ends, which are the governance side of things. And the issue that we have is loss of businesses, and I've been guilty of this myself, is you end up getting pulled too far into the operational world. You're not strategically thinking. You don't have time to plan and to step back and just get the basics right. You're very focused on the new thing. Like at the moment, make sure that you have zero trust where you can and multi-factor authentication where you can. And you run after the bouncing ball instead of like sitting back. Like most of these issues, if you were to sit back and go, okay, where is my data? What am I doing to protect it? And how do people access it? If you ask yourself those three questions and you work around that for the next year, you'll be far further along than you will with your compliance project and your technology transformation projects if you just got those very, very basics, like Roberts has said before.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because, sort of like, again, it's probably worth underlining the fact that, compliance does not equal data protection or the protection of your data.
Not at
It
all.
is just that it's just compliance, right?
In some cases, though, like compliance, so like at 7001, for example, which a lot of people get for both the right and the wrong reasons. But you got to understand that once you're compliant to 27001, you're doing the exact bare minimum to manage risk.
Yeah, and everyone's looking at it like, the golden, the golden triangle is the thing to be. It's where I want to be. They must be great because they've got ISO 27001.
Right? Which all that means is they manage their risk, they mark down exactly what their risk is, and they have processes in place so that they can do something about it. And
Yeah,
it's only been recently in the last iterations of 27001 where they even have to prove the efficacy of their control. So previous to that, you didn't have to prove the control was good. You just had to prove you had it.
yeah. So, Robert, supply chain security was the next big point from the report.
Yeah, yeah. So I sort of list this under trending. So maybe this was something we'll see coming up in the next year or so. So yeah, there seems to be a lot of attention around supply chain security and compliance. So we sort of talk about, it's not just about your business, but who do you outsource to? What is their security posture like? What are their vulnerabilities like? Because if those are weak, then it doesn't matter how much you spend on your own cyber resilience. And if your suppliers don't have good posture, then you're going to have issues. I guess interestingly, whilst certainly with Australia, I'm sure it applies in Europe as well, the responsibility for the breach will likely come back to the controller of that information. What we've seen here is this particular case that's raised in the report is the information commissioner in the UK going after the actual supply chain vendor themselves. So just sort of going through very quickly some of the information, some of the context here. So this is back in March 2025. They fined a company called Advanced Computer Software, just an IT and software services provider. That was 3.49 million euros. This is around 6 million Australian dollars for security failings. They processed personal data on behalf of customers, which included the NHS in the UK, other healthcare providers. In 2022, has accessed certain systems of Advanced, and they got through via a customer account that did not have multi-factor authentication. That led to disruption to critical services, including the NHS helpline 111, NHS 111, and certain healthcare staff were unable to access patient records. And as you can imagine, we're talking about critical services here,
Yeah.
critical infrastructure, so it's pretty significant. And the Information Commissioner found that Advanced did not have the appropriate technical and organizational measures in place to keep its health and care systems fully secure. This was the first fine against a processor under the UK GDPR and indicates the regulator's recognition of the widespread impact of failures by processors serving multiple controllers. So organizations who are controlling, they take in the
Yeah.
data, and then you have suppliers who are processing that data for them. A little bit like Capita, so you're outsourcing business process, and so in this case they're looking at the supply chain, and they're going after the supply, and they find the suppliers. So again, just quite an interesting example. Be interesting to see if we see regulators going after the supply chain as well as the main
Yeah,
organization.
it's kind of distasteful in some respects. I mean, obviously, this hinders people getting the right drugs or the right treatment of some description. It just hinders that whole process, which is life threatening, I suppose, in some respects, or certainly, it's not a nice place to be at. I mean, in that sort of vertical, everything just seems to be a little bit distasteful to me, and it just gives these kind of people leverage, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%. That's the reason why they're the targets, right, of an awful lot of this. The one issue or worry that I have with the regulators perhaps providing for the rest of the supply chain, both upstream and downstream, is how logistically they'll be able to manage that. So if you have a technology company that happens to serve oil and gas or health, do they then come under the same jurisdiction and the same rules as a hospital will? And if they do, then all that's going to do is drive cost in the industry, which will have repercussions down the line. And although every company should be protecting all of their assets and information, to have a provider have to keep records for 15 years, 20 years, those type of things, all of that just increase operating costs for very little value considering where the business is. So it would be interesting to see how this goes. Just logistically, I don't think it can scale that way.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. So the last point here, Robert, was around personal liability. Now we talked about this, I think, the week before last, and Adam raised the specter around this, and this is really getting into the guts of things now, where we've been talking for years about well, directors are responsible, the CEO is responsible. This actually is now being quite prescriptive about the fact of who is responsible. So if we've heard stories about people going in asking for budgets being knocked back. Maybe they haven't asked in the appropriate fashion, but now all of a sudden directors, are they going to, is this particular sort of item around getting people to take these things more seriously than, hey, this is more than a budgetary concern, Sunshine?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we've talked about it a fair bit, and I think the general point I've come back with in terms of why aren't we seeing directors held accountable is because the Corporations Act is a bit broad, and so it's not easy to hold directors accountable because you can sort of say, well, I relied on expert advice and I was acting reasonably and in good faith when I did so. So I brought in the CISO, I brought in an independent expert to advise on cybersecurity. And by doing so, I fulfilled my duties as a director. So it's quite hard under the main provisions of the Corporations Act to bring, and unless those directors' offices have been absolutely egregious in terms of the sorts of actions that they did or didn't take,
Yeah.
it's quite hard for ASIC to bring those sorts of actions. So putting that to one side, what's quite interesting is that Europe have been looking at this, and the main thing they're focused on is an organization called Clearview AI, and they actually did get investigated in Australia as well a few years back, and they sort of went around collecting all sorts of data on individuals, personal data, biometric data, facial data, all sorts of stuff without consent. And so a number of jurisdictions regulators took them to court, and that included in Australia. So the Office of the Information Commissioner here also investigated Clearview.
Yeah.
And in Australia, they basically said, you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Can you please delete all of that data? And they didn't take it any further. And it's not even clear if Clearview complied with the direction from the OAIC. So that's the Australian side of it. In Europe, the Dutch in particular went after Clearview and were weighing up whether they could hold the directors and officers personally liable for the actions of Clearview, given that they were doing similar things over there as well and not complying with directions. So that was raised. I think it was raised in 24, but they looked at it again in 25 about whether they were going to go and investigate the directors. But what's interesting is that there's a privacy activist group, NOYB, based in Austria, and they have announced so basically their role is a digital rights protection. I'm trying to think. There's a US equivalent that also sort of does this. Is it the Frontier Organization? Anyway, Electronic Frontier Organization, similar organization based in Austria. They're looking to bring actions. They've got a whole bunch of legal and other experts who help look around Europe to bring actions against organizations breaching GDPR, and so they've filed a criminal complaint in Austria against Clearview and its managers for breaches of the Austrian Data Protection Act for these similar sorts of things that Clearview have been doing. I mean, on the one hand, it's interesting because they're pursuing it. Clearview doesn't have a presence now in Europe. There's going to be no consequences for those directors and officers because they don't have a presence here and they're not going to be able to enforce it in the US. However, it may set a precedent. And so if future organizations do something similar, then it might be that if this precedent is set and NOYB win this particular case, then the next time it comes along, directors and officers might be liable in Europe. And so this might be something, whether there's necessarily equivalence in Australia, maybe not. However, it's just something to kind of keep an eye on. And again, it's something it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in Australia against directors and officers, particularly if we start to see them being held accountable in Europe. Even if the ability isn't there right now, then there might be some momentum, some kind of nudging that leads to amendments under Australian law, under the Corporations Act, which makes it clearer about holding the directors and officers accountable here.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting where you got to start somewhere, right? I mean, and obviously taking the most wild cases is going to be a good place to start because it actually helps formulate the thinking for where what's right. It's kind of interesting that you need to go through what's morally acceptable to begin with, though. To me, it is anyway. It's just insane, right? Absolutely insane. Is there any observations that you've got, Adam? Because I know this was a point that you brought up a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it's just, what's new?
Look, we have to follow on. The only concern is if the government continues the same pace, as Robert had said with the Corporations Act, we'll have a number of acts that have the ability to be able to keep people accountable, but aren't written in a way where they can ever be accountable. And so then it looks like on paper we talked about compliance not giving an outcome. On compliance tick, we can, but it can never actually really happen. So it doesn't work. Unfortunately, the control's ineffective.
Yeah, your risks aren't properly catalogued and all the other bits and pieces. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's a really, I think we've given people three things there. I mean, to sort of like consider around GDPR and that type of legislation as to how it might look. I mean, it's coming at us in 3D, I suppose. It's just coming at its at glacial speed, it seems like at this moment in time. The current government, I don't know whether there's going to be any change. I mean, we thought they had a big mandate to go and do something for us, but here we are. Now, Adam, I know that you actually were talking a little bit earlier about what's been happening in the big wide world out there, and there's news coming through on the wire around a big hack. You think?
Yeah, so potentially. Well, I'll make sure I use the right words for Robert.
Allegedly,
There's a potential. So yesterday, a criminal group named WorldLeaks claimed to have stolen 1.4 terabytes of data from Nike and published samples onto a dark web leak site. Now, this group, WorldLeaks, they're actually a rebrand of another group called Hunters International. So that they were a ransomware group before. They started back in 2023. Their tactic now, though, is data extortion only. So they don't actually encrypt anything anymore. They've left all of those types of technologies behind, and they get in and steal. To add to the validity of the group, this is the same group that stole a lot of data from Dell back in July of 2025. So there's a good chance that something has happened here. The downside, we were talking about risk when it comes to your supply chain. So Nike's declined to confirm any of the specific data that was stolen. They've also declined on whether a ransom was paid or not, which is fair enough. But the other thing is they didn't confirm if any of their wholesale partners were affected, like Macy's or JD Sports or any of the other companies that work directly with Nike. That's more the worry. So if it's also their downstream partners that have been affected because of an issue with them, or if any of their new software products, like they've got a bunch of biometrics and health apps now that you can utilize on your Apple Watch, for example. So at the moment, it doesn't look like anything like that has been taken, but again, there was only a small amount of directories which were around women's sportswear, men's sportswear, factory training resources, and garment making processes.
Well, it's something to be aware of, I guess, and something to be wary of. Any observations from you, Robert, before we close?
It comes back to the old chestnuts of it's a matter of when, not if. I suppose we'll wait to see, but you do kind of wonder. So what did Nike do to protect its crown jewels? You can imagine. So you got personal information, but let's say they had their latest designs. Let's say the new Vaporfly, whatever that might be. Whatever cutting edge technology. Let's say those designs were stolen. But had they been encrypted, what's going to happen to that sort of information? Is that going to be sold to a competitor? So it kind of makes you wonder. An organization the size of Nike, hopefully they had some good controls in place, and if they didn't, well, it's a pretty expensive lesson to learn.
People forget
Terabyte.
about good old espionage, don't they? It's been happening forever.
Yeah, but terabytes this time, terabytes of data. I mean, it's when you start measuring it in those kind of volumes, it's yeah, you wonder what the hell is in that mix, right?
It also
Okay,
shows
well,
a bit of a gap, right? Because that would take a while to come out of the data center. So to
yeah,
actually take,
yeah,
nearly 2 terabytes
yeah,
of data
yeah.
takes a
Who
while.
who was
Yeah.
responsible for that?
What
Yeah,
what alerts triggered there, and was anyone actually paying any attention?
yeah, but we just do shoes. It's okay. Okay, guys, look, thank you very much. That was Chat DPS for this week, and we look forward to catching up with you again really soon. Hope you found it interesting. I certainly did. So thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, everyone.